The spring of 1942 descended upon the Philippines with the slow, metallic rhythm of retreat. The air was heavy with humidity and gunpowder, and the forests, once dense with the hum of insects, now carried only the echo of collapsing front lines. On the Bataan Peninsula, the last organized American and Filipino resistance against the Imperial Japanese Army had fractured into fragments of exhaustion. From the skies came the drone of engines that no longer met opposition. The few remaining American aircraft had long been reduced to wreckage or stripped for parts. The men below, soldiers of the United States Army forces in the Far East, had been surviving on half rations of rice and foraged roots. Their bodies thinned, their uniforms stiffened with salt and grime. By April, dysentery and malaria had become as constant as the sunrise. When the surrender order came, it did not sound like defeat. It sounded like relief. On April 9, 1942, more than 70,000 men laid down their weapons under the relentless sun. They were marched northward, unarmed, stripped of insignia, through roads lined with wrecked vehicles and abandoned munitions. The march would be known later by a name carved into memory and testimony: Bataan. The documentary record shows the faces gaunt, sunburned, eyes hollow with hunger. Cameras captured their silent procession, a river of men swallowed by dust. They drank from ditches, from puddles mixed with oil. Some stumbled, and those who could not rise were left. The tropical heat shimmered over the asphalt, turning the air itself into a physical weight. Japanese military discipline regarded surrender as shame. The captured Americans, accustomed to the conventions of Geneva, found themselves in a moral inversion, their humanity conditional, their endurance a test without rules. The Japanese guards, many young and untrained, alternated between mechanical indifference and bursts of violence. The column stretched for miles through villages where civilians watched from doorways, unsure whether pity was permitted. Days blended, the numbers diminished. At night, the sky above the march was a dark sea broken by stars indifferent to human suffering. Later records would count thousands dead before reaching the railhead at San Fernando. From there, survivors were crammed into boxcars, 100 men per steel carriage, suffocating in the tropical night. Those who collapsed were trampled. When the doors opened at Capas, the air smelled of iron and decay. The first camps rose from this movement of bodies: Camp O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, Davao. Hastily assembled barracks of bamboo and thatch stood amid mud and mosquitoes. The captives were assigned numbers, their names written on rough rosters in Japanese script. Each camp was a world within fences, ruled by the mathematics of ration and punishment. In the first months, disease spread faster than hope. Burial details worked without pause, digging graves in the clay. The dead were catalogued by number, their effects burned or taken. Yet even within this arithmetic of loss, there was an undercurrent of survival. Men traded scraps of cloth for spoons, bamboo for bowls, gestures for fragments of dignity. News of the outside world arrived as rumor. The fall of Corregidor, the bombing of Tokyo, whispers of a turning tide that no one could confirm. Letters were forbidden. Memory became the only correspondence. Documentary fragments from this period, military reports, recovered journals, Japanese administrative notes, reveal the transformation of men into subjects of endurance, their lives reduced to metrics: caloric intake, labor output, mortality rate. Yet beyond statistics lay a quieter story: the slow internal recalibration of men unmade by captivity. They learned to count time by the sound of the guards' footsteps, by the pattern of meals reduced to ladles of rice and miso soup, so thin it barely tinted the water. Hunger became both an enemy and a teacher. In the absence of weapons, survival was practiced through ritual, washing with rainwater, saving crumbs for those who could not stand. By late 1942, transport lists began to circulate. Selected groups of prisoners were shipped to Japan, Formosa, and Manchuria to serve as labor for the empire's expanding war industries. They were herded into freighters, known among survivors as hell ships, dark holds where air and light were privileges. Many did not reach the destination. Those who did emerged in a different kind of captivity, colder, more ordered, more absolute. From this point forward, the war ceased to be a matter of battles and became one of endurance, measured by body weight, temperature, and silence. The camera of history pans across these anonymous faces, pausing not on individual heroism, but on collective fatigue. The chronicle ends this phase with a notation that captivity, for the Americans in Japanese hands, was not a singular event, but a continuum. In the records of 1942, they appear as entries, names, numbers, cause of death. But behind those sterile lines stood men whose humanity persisted in gestures unrecorded: the passing of a canteen, the folding of a flag fragment, the murmured grace before eating nothing at all. This is where the chronicle of hunger begins. The next phase will see its transformation, from deprivation to encounter, from starvation to the paradoxical offering of food that would break more than the body. By late 1942, the Pacific had stabilized into a geography of imprisonment. Across the islands and along the Japanese mainland, American, British, Australian, and Dutch captives were dispersed through a network of camps bound by a single logic: labor as reparation. The war machine consumed fuel, ore, and men with equal indifference, and the prisoners, stripped of rank and nation, became part of that consumption. The Japanese administration maintained meticulous records. Each camp held ledgers: height, weight, age, occupation. The entries diminished month by month as starvation thinned the ranks. Rice rations averaged 400 grams per day, sometimes less, supplemented with barley, a few leaves of cabbage, or the gray water of miso. Protein was a rumor. Occasionally a fish head, boiled until disintegration, served as collective memory of the sea. Work began before sunrise. In Davao, they cleared swamps for airfields. In Fukuoka and Osaka, they shoveled coal in mines lit by kerosene lamps. Labor details moved through dawn fog like extensions of the same organism, driven by shouted cadence and the certainty of punishment. The guards followed schedules learned from military manuals: efficient, exact, unyielding. Every hour was accounted for, every gesture watched. Winter introduced a new vocabulary of suffering. Those transported to Honshu or Hokkaido discovered a climate foreign to their tropical bones. Snow settled on the tin roofs, and frost crept through bamboo walls. Clothing was thin, shoes often replaced by rags. Frostbite blackened toes, and the stench of gangrene mingled with coal smoke. In the morning roll call, men stood motionless until counted, their breath rising in pale columns against the iron sky. Medical facilities existed in name only. Each camp maintained a dispensary staffed by captured medics who had no medicine. Bandages were made from scraps of bedding, disinfectant from ash and salt. Death was quiet, an exhalation rather than an event. The dead were recorded, carried on stretchers, buried at the perimeter. The earth remembered what paperwork could not. Yet within this architecture of control, a parallel order emerged, improvised, invisible. Prisoners developed systems of barter and communication. A scrap of newspaper smuggled from a Japanese guard's ration box became a portal to the outside world. A secret code of knocks on the barracks wall carried news between huts. Hope existed not as certainty, but as rhythm, maintained through repetition. The Japanese command permitted occasional lectures on imperial ethics, where propaganda films depicted smiling workers, fertile fields, and divine purpose. The captives were assembled to watch, their faces expressionless. The images contrasted sharply with the mud under their feet. The narrator of history notes that psychological warfare sought not only obedience, but redefinition, to turn prisoners into witnesses of Japan's moral order. Food became the central axis of existence. Hunger structured time. Meals divided the day into two small moments of anticipation. The sound of the ladle against the metal pot summoned an instinct older than fear. Men counted grains of rice as if measuring hours of life. Occasionally, the camp received shipments of surplus fish or vegetables. The distribution followed rank or favor, and those who worked hardest were sometimes rewarded with a thin slice of pickled radish, its acidity burning like revelation. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. Many were never delivered. In their place, men wrote imaginary replies, spoken only in thought, private monologues recorded by memory alone. The absence of communication hollowed them from within. Yet among them were those who documented everything, etching notes onto scraps of cloth, the backs of labels, cigarette papers flattened smooth. These would later surface in archives and museums, anonymous handwriting preserving the truth denied to official reports. Cultural misunderstanding deepened the division. For the Japanese guards, obedience was moral clarity. For the Americans, it was humiliation. When prisoners bowed to avoid beatings, they did so with clenched jaws, not reverence. The guards misread the gesture as insolence, perpetuating the cycle. Decades later, historians would interpret these interactions not as simple cruelty, but as collisions of incompatible codes of honor. By mid-1943, war production required propaganda victories. The Japanese Ministry of War issued directives to improve conditions and to document the humane treatment of foreign prisoners. Selected camps were designated for inspection by neutral observers, though visits were carefully staged. Barracks were cleaned, rations increased for a day, and prisoners rehearsed routines of health and discipline. The illusion of civility became another instrument of control. It was during this period that the event later remembered as the meal began to take shape. Preparations were recorded in a logistical report from a mainland camp near Niigata, where American prisoners were employed unloading coal. A directive ordered that on the emperor's birthday, a ceremonial lunch be served to display benevolence. The meal was to include rice, miso soup, and, unprecedented in any POW menu, sushi. At the time, none of the prisoners knew what the word meant. To them, it would have sounded like another ration of rice, perhaps with fish. But in the cultural calculus of Japan, sushi was not sustenance. It was ceremony, refinement, and pride. The planned meal represented a statement that the empire could be merciful and superior in the same gesture. The months preceding the event passed in routine monotony. Men continued to weaken. Work details returned at dusk, skeletal silhouettes against the snow. The war beyond the fence remained distant thunder. The Guadalcanal campaign, the rising tide of American counteroffensives, rumors of bombings. Inside the wire, existence was measured not by battles, but by calories. The camera of the chronicle pans across faces indistinguishable from one another, united by the shared absence of expression. Each frame captures survival at its most mechanical, movement without emotion, life without future tense. And yet beneath this silence, something invisible begins to form. The anticipation of a meal that none could yet imagine, an encounter that would mark the breaking point between endurance and collapse. Spring returned to the Niigata labor camp in small increments, meltwater seeping through the packed snow, the smell of coal dust giving way to damp earth. In April 1943, the administration received a directive from regional headquarters. A ceremonial event was to be staged to commemorate the emperor's birthday and demonstrate Japan's benevolence toward foreign captives. The document specified food, music, and photographic record. The date was fixed. Preparations began a week in advance. The kitchen detail, usually tasked with boiling rice into gray paste, was ordered to scrub the iron pots until they gleamed. Barrels of vinegar, soy sauce, and dried seaweed arrived by truck, marked for special use. The guards moved differently that week. Less shouting, more precision. The prisoners noticed, though none could explain the sudden formality. On the morning of the event, the camp yard was cleared. The prisoners were assembled, counted, and told to sit on the ground. Tables were brought from the officers' quarters, wooden boards on sawhorses covered with thin cloth. Cameras were positioned at measured angles. The smell that drifted from the kitchen was alien, sharp, marine, almost sweet. The meal was presented in silence. Each man received a tray containing small portions arranged with deliberate symmetry. Compact mounds of vinegared rice, thin slices of raw fish glistening under the pale light, a square of pickled radish, a strip of dried seaweed, a bowl of miso clearer than usual, and tea poured from kettles polished for the occasion. To the Japanese officers, this was an act of civilization, proof that even enemies could partake in the refinement of imperial culture. To the prisoners, the food was incomprehensible. The fish, raw and cool, carried the scent of the sea, a smell long absent from their diet of boiled grains and gruel. Some hesitated. Some ate without thought, driven by hunger alone. Others studied the tray as if confronting something sacred or forbidden. The rice clung together, sticky and foreign on their tongues. The vinegar burned in mouths unaccustomed to flavor. For a few, the sudden richness triggered revolt in their stomachs. Bodies that had endured starvation could not easily accept abundance. Nausea swept the ranks like an unseen contagion. The contrast between months of deprivation and this sudden, ceremonial excess was more than physical. It reached into memory, reminders of home, of meals shared in peace, of lives erased by the war. Photographers captured the moment. American soldiers eating Japanese food under guard. The intended message, that captives were well treated, was preserved on film, later distributed to Tokyo for propaganda use. The actual truth, unrecorded by the camera, unfolded silently in the aftermath. As the meal ended, the remains of fish and rice were collected, the trays stacked. The guards resumed their usual tone. The prisoners were ordered back to the barracks. Night came early, and within the huts the men lay restless, their stomachs unsettled, their minds adrift. Some wept without sound. Others stared into the dark, unable to name what had broken inside them. In medical logs compiled later by Allied investigators, several cases of acute digestive failure were noted that week. The notes made no mention of emotion, yet the surviving testimonies, written years afterward, described a different kind of collapse. The sushi meal, brief and extraordinary, had exposed the fragility of adaptation. In that single gesture of supposed mercy, the captives confronted everything they had lost: the rituals of food, the sense of choice, the dignity of normal life. The Japanese staff considered the event a success. Reports filed to headquarters praised the orderliness of the occasion, the gratitude of the prisoners, the efficiency of the kitchen. The photographs, when printed, showed smiling men, bowls in hand. The official caption read, Humanitarian Treatment of American Prisoners, Niigata, April 1943. For the prisoners, the images bore no resemblance to memory. What remained in their recollection was the taste, salt, vinegar, the faint metallic echo of raw fish, and the sudden realization that civilization could be weaponized as effectively as hunger. The following day, work resumed. The same coal, the same cold, the same thin rations returned. The ceremonial utensils vanished back into storage. The guards no longer smiled. The event dissolved into routine, yet its residue lingered. Men began to speak of it in whispers, not as a gift, but as a moment when endurance had cracked. The chroniclers of the post-war years would later interpret the incident through psychological frameworks: cultural shock, sensory trauma, conditioned aversion. But within the camp, it had no vocabulary. It was simply the day of the fish. From that day forward, meals were eaten faster, without reflection. The act of nourishment had become suspect, charged with memory. Some men refused the occasional fish scrap that appeared afterward, unable to separate taste from humiliation. By summer, the episode had faded from Japanese records, overshadowed by larger events: the bombing of Rabaul, the loss of the Solomons, the tightening blockade. But within the closed world of the camp, the sushi meal endured as a private legend, a marker of the boundary between body and mind. The Chronicle notes this point without comment. History often preserves the measurable: dates, numbers, orders. Yet here, something unquantifiable took place, an encounter between two civilizations reduced to ritual amid ruin. The gesture of refinement, offered without understanding, became a mirror in which both sides glimpsed their own contradictions. The year after the ceremonial meal dissolved into a calendar of repetition. The coal ships continued to come and go from the frozen harbor. Prisoners still filed out before dawn, black dust clinging to their lungs. The rhythm of the camp resumed, yet something imperceptible had changed. The event that had begun as spectacle had passed into memory, but memory in captivity did not fade. It fermented. Accounts written decades later describe a new caution around food. Rations that once offered momentary comfort now carried undertones of unease. The men ate mechanically, without conversation. Those who had been ill after the sushi rarely spoke of it, but the silence itself became part of the camp's structure, like the fences and the roll calls. The act of eating, once the last refuge of humanity, had become another ritual of endurance. Through 1943 and 1944, the war tightened around Japan like a closing fist. Allied bombers drew nearer each month, and supply routes began to collapse. Camps that had once received measured shipments of rice and barley now relied on substitutes: millet, soy husks, thin soup thickened with seaweed powder. Hunger deepened again, and with it the body's capacity for adaptation grew paradoxically stronger. In winter, the barracks walls shook under the weight of wind. Fires were forbidden except for the officers, so the prisoners layered rags, huddled together, and spoke of warmth as if it were a distant continent. Disease came in cycles: beriberi, pellagra, dysentery. Each outbreak carried away a handful of men. The burial detail no longer kept formal records. They carved small marks into a post near the perimeter, one for each day's dead. Japanese discipline, stretched by shortages and fatigue, hardened. Punishments multiplied, though the guards themselves grew thinner, more nervous. The empire that had once appeared invincible now trembled under distant explosions. Yet the camp's internal logic persisted. The same orders recited each morning, the same gestures of submission and inspection. History continued in miniature behind the barbed wire, as if detached from the outer war. Within this shrinking world, recollection became both refuge and danger. The prisoners' minds drifted toward food, toward home, toward the remembered textures of normal life. But when those thoughts reached the point of taste, many stopped. The meal of 1943 had imprinted itself as a boundary, the moment when longing collided with revulsion. It was as if the body had learned that even comfort could wound. Archival fragments mention small acts of preservation. One prisoner carved the outline of a fish into a scrap of wood, painting it with soot and ash. Another saved a thread of seaweed from the meal, pressing it between the pages of a prayer book. To outsiders, these objects might seem trivial, yet within the logic of captivity they were monuments, proof that memory could be contained, controlled, mastered. By late 1944, Allied aircraft began appearing overhead. The guards ordered blackouts. Work details were reduced as the harbor emptied of ships. Rumors spread of defeats: Saipan, Leyte, Okinawa. The sound of distant bombing reached even the northern camps, a low tremor in the night that felt like approaching deliverance. Yet liberation was still abstract, an idea measured in whispers rather than miles. The prisoners' bodies had become archives of survival. Bones protruded through skin, yet endurance persisted as a form of discipline. They counted seasons by the pattern of illnesses, by the arrival of new guards, by the changing color of the sky at dusk. Time no longer advanced. It accumulated. In early 1945, the first American reconnaissance planes were sighted over Niigata. The camp administration grew erratic. Rations vanished entirely for days at a time. The prisoners scavenged weeds from the edges of the compound, boiling them into dark, bitter soup. Hunger once more unified them in its simplicity, a return to the one certainty the war had left intact. On the night of March 10th, distant flames illuminated the horizon, Tokyo burning. The guards watched silently, faces turned east. For a brief moment, the captives saw their captors as human, frightened, weary, uncertain. The hierarchy of power, though still enforced, had begun to erode. When the surrender finally came in August, it arrived as confusion. Orders ceased. Gates remained closed, but the shouting stopped. Days passed before Allied planes dropped leaflets confirming the end. The prisoners, reduced to shadows of their former selves, stepped into the light like ghosts returning from myth. In the weeks that followed, medical officers recorded the condition of the liberated men. Average weight 65 pounds below enlistment, teeth lost to malnutrition, vision blurred from vitamin deficiency. Psychological reports, cautious in language, noted episodes of emotional disorientation in the presence of food. During the first rehabilitation meals aboard hospital ships, some men could not eat. The sight of fish, even cooked, brought tremors, tears, or silence. One entry in a naval physician's journal described a patient who refused a plate of rice and tuna, stating only that he did not want to remember. The physician, unaware of the history, marked it as a symptom of stress. Decades later, survivors would connect such reactions to that single afternoon in 1943 when taste had become indistinguishable from pain. The Japanese officers responsible for the ceremony were never charged. Their actions fell outside the definitions of cruelty recognized by the tribunals. The photographs of smiling men eating sushi remained in archives, mislabeled, detached from context. The reality they concealed persisted only in the testimony of those who had lived it, a quiet testament to the complexity of mercy under occupation. The chronicle closes this chapter not with resolution, but with the recognition that survival is not the same as restoration. The war ended. Nations rebuilt. Ceremonies of remembrance replaced ceremonies of domination. Yet for the men of Niigata, the taste of that meal lingered beyond liberation, a sensory echo that bridged captivity and freedom. In every era, historians search for symbols to explain human endurance. Here, the symbol was accidental. A meal meant as propaganda that became a mirror of the entire war's paradox, culture entwined with brutality, refinement offered amid ruin. The sushi that once signified grace became, in memory, the flavor of dislocation. Liberation arrived not as triumph, but as stillness. The gates of the Niigata camp stood open, the guards vanished into the countryside, their uniforms discarded, their rifles buried. American reconnaissance planes circled above the harbor, dropping supplies in bright canisters that split upon impact. Rice, tinned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, luxuries beyond imagination, rained from the sky. Men ran toward them on legs unaccustomed to running, their laughter brittle, uncertain, half-believed. Medical officers and correspondents followed. The camp, filmed in early September, appeared less a place of life than an archaeological site. Skeletal figures moving through mud, structures leaning under the weight of neglect. The first official reports noted dehydration, malaria, beriberi, frostbite, scurvy. What they could not record was the silence that followed every distribution of food. Even in freedom, eating required courage. The survivors were transported first to Yokohama, then to hospital ships anchored in the bay. There they met the world again, clean sheets, white uniforms, the hum of electric lights. Their reflection in mirrors was unrecognizable. For some, joy was immediate. For others, the transition reopened wounds that starvation had numbed. The taste of ordinary meals, broth, bread, meat, brought confusion, tears, and occasionally collapse. Doctors prescribed gradual refeeding, small portions at fixed intervals, vitamin therapy, sunlight, and rest. Yet a pattern emerged. Men would pause when seafood appeared on the tray. Some turned away. Others forced themselves to eat, their hands trembling. The medical charts recorded loss of appetite or emotional disturbance. None mentioned the memory of the sushi meal. None could translate it into clinical language. Repatriation ships crossed the Pacific through autumn. On board, the atmosphere hovered between celebration and disbelief. The men spoke in fragments, recollections of labor, of comrades buried, of endless days without time. When the conversation turned to food, voices faltered. The older ones said nothing. They stared instead at the horizon, where Japan diminished into mist. In San Francisco, the returning soldiers were met by bands, cameras, speeches. The public saw them as heroes reclaimed from darkness. Newspapers printed photographs of recovery, men smiling, eating American meals, raising glasses of milk. None of these images revealed the hesitation that preceded every bite. The inner dissonance between hunger and fear remained invisible, unphotographed. For months after arrival, hospitals filled with former POWs undergoing rehabilitation. Nutrition specialists noted peculiar aversions: vinegar, fish, fermented smells. One physician described it as a conditioned reflex to survival stress. Another called it a cultural rejection born of trauma. The words failed to capture the depth of the association. To the survivors, the taste itself had become a landscape, one they could not re-enter. Interviews conducted by the U.S. Army's Medical Corps in early 1946 attempted to chart the psychological dimensions of captivity. Many spoke of hunger, beatings, disease. Only a few mentioned the day they were fed sushi. Those who did so described it without bitterness, only confusion. They spoke of the brightness of the fish, the gleam of vinegar, the sense that mercy could feel like mockery when offered by those who held power. None could explain why the memory endured while others faded. The official history of the Pacific War listed the Niigata camp among dozens of sites of forced labor. Its record remained impersonal: location, population, casualties. The ceremonial meal appeared nowhere in those summaries. It survived instead in letters written decades later, when the men had grown old and language had softened. They wrote of the taste as a turning point, the moment they understood that captivity was not only physical but cultural, that domination could arrive dressed as courtesy. In 1946, Allied tribunals in Tokyo processed thousands of documents. The Japanese officers from Niigata testified through interpreters. They described the meal proudly as an act of compassion, an illustration of the emperor's grace. No charges were brought. In the official transcript, the event remained a benign detail, an administrative gesture lost amid greater crimes. Yet one Allied observer, a historian attached to the tribunal, noted privately that the photographs of the smiling prisoners looked strangely brittle, like images taken at the edge of madness. As the world rebuilt, memory fragmented. The war became history. The camps became statistics. Survivors dispersed across America, some returning to families, others to hospitals or quiet isolation. They built lives, worked, aged. Only occasionally did the past resurface: a smell in a fish market, a television program about Japan's recovery, a dinner invitation politely declined. In oral histories recorded half a century later, the men spoke with measured voices. One described the sushi meal as the moment we remembered we were human, and it broke us. Another said, it wasn't cruelty, it was misunderstanding. They tried to feed us their pride. Scholars later cited these testimonies as evidence of the psychological complexity of captivity, where gestures of culture could wound as deeply as deprivation. In museums, the few surviving photographs from Niigata are displayed under neutral lighting. Visitors see emaciated men seated before neat trays, unaware of the unseen aftermath. Labels read simply, Emperor's Birthday Celebration, 1943. The images remain ambiguous, proof of humanity for some, irony for others. The truth exists only in the convergence of both. The documentary record concludes with a reflection rather than a judgment. Between the extremes of cruelty and compassion lies a territory of misunderstanding, where intention and impact diverge beyond reconciliation. The sushi meal, insignificant to the war's outcome, revealed something larger, that even the most civilized gesture can carry the weight of domination when framed by captivity. History does not often remember tastes. It records battles, treaties, and speeches, but rarely the sensations that bind memory to the body. For the American prisoners of Niigata, taste became the final battlefield, the place where the war lingered long after its end. When they returned home, they found themselves living among abundance once more. Supermarkets filled with food, restaurants revived the very dishes that had defined the enemy's culture. In time, sushi appeared in American cities as a novelty, then a staple. The irony passed unnoticed by most, yet for those who had lived the war inside a bowl of vinegared rice and raw fish, its arrival was not exotic but haunted, a reminder that the past can return not as history but as flavor. The chronicle ends with that paradox. Civilization and barbarity, hunger and refinement, captivity and culture, all coexist within the same gesture, the same meal. The camera of history withdraws from Niigata's frozen harbor, leaving behind empty barracks and the echo of waves against the pier. What remains is silence, carrying the aftertaste of survival, salt, vinegar, and the knowledge that memory itself is indigestible.